In philosophy, idealism is the group of philosophies which assert that reality, or reality as we can know it, is fundamentally mental, mentally constructed, or otherwise immaterial. Epistemologically, idealism manifests as a skepticism about the possibility of knowing any mind-independent thing. In a sociological sense, idealism emphasizes how human ideas, especially beliefs and values, shape society. As an ontological doctrine, idealism goes further, asserting that all entities are composed of mind or spirit. Idealism thus rejects physicalist and dualist theories that fail to ascribe priority to the mind. The earliest extant arguments that the world of experience is grounded in the mental derive from India and Greece. The Hindu idealists in India and the Greek Neoplatonists gave panentheistic arguments for an all-pervading consciousness as the ground or true nature of reality. In contrast, the Yogacara school, which arose within Mahayana Buddhism in India in the 4th century CE, based its mind-only idealism to a greater extent on phenomenological analyses of personal experience. This turned toward the subjective anticipated empiricists such as George Berkeley, who revived idealism in 18th century Europe by employing skeptical arguments against materialism. Beginning with Immanuel Kant, German idealists such as G. W. F. Hegel, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, and Arthur Schopenhauer dominated 19th century philosophy. This tradition, which emphasized the mental or ideal character of all phenomena, gave birth to idealistic and subjectivist schools ranging from British idealism to phenomenalism to existentialism. The historical influence of this branch of idealism remains central even to the schools that rejected its metaphysical assumptions, such as Marxism, pragmatism and positivism. Definitions. Idealism is a term with several related meanings. It comes via idea from the Greek ideon, meaning to see. The term entered the English language by 1743. In ordinary use, as when speaking of Woodrow Wilson's political idealism, it generally suggests the priority of ideals, principles, values, and goals over concrete realities. Idealists are understood to represent the world as it might or should be, unlike pragmatists, who focus on the world as it presently is. In the arts, similarly, idealism affirms imagination and attempts to realize a mental conception of beauty, a standard of perfection, juxtaposed to aesthetic naturalism and realism. Any philosophy that assigns crucial importance to the ideal or spiritual realm in its account of human existence may be termed idealist. Metaphysical idealism is an ontological doctrine that holds that reality itself is incorporeal or experiential at its core. Beyond this, idealists disagree on which aspects of the mental are more basic. Platonic idealism affirms that abstractions are more basic to reality than the things we perceive, while subjective idealists and phenomenalists tend to privilege sensory experience over abstract reasoning. Subjective idealists like George Berkeley are anti-realists in terms of a mind-independent world, whereas transcendental idealists like Immanuel Kant are strong skeptics of such a world, affirming epistemological and not metaphysical idealism. Thus Kant defines idealism as the assertion that we can never be certain whether all of our putative outer experience is not mere imagining. He claimed that, according to idealism, the reality of external objects does not admit of strict proof. On the contrary, however, the reality of the object of our internal sense is clear immediately through consciousness. However, not all idealists restrict the real or the knowable to our immediate subjective experience. Objective idealists make claims about a trans-empirical world, but simply deny that this world is essentially divorced from or ontologically prior to the mental. Thus Plato and Gottfried Leibniz affirm an objective and knowable reality transcending our subjective awareness, a rejection of epistemological idealism, but propose that this reality is grounded in ideal entities. a form of metaphysical idealism. Nor do all metaphysical idealists agree on the nature of the ideal. For Plato, the fundamental entities were non-mental abstract forms, while for Leibniz they were proto-mental and concrete monads. As a rule, transcendental idealists like Kant affirm idealism's epistemic side without committing themselves to whether reality is ultimately mental, objective. Idealists like Plato affirm reality's metaphysical basis in the mental or abstract without restricting their epistemology to ordinary experience, and subjective idealists like Berkeley affirm both metaphysical and epistemological idealism. Classical idealism. Monistic idealism holds that consciousness, not matter, is the ground of all being. It is monist because it holds that there is only one type of thing in the universe, and idealist because it holds that one thing to be consciousness. Anaxagoras was known as nous because he taught that all things were created by mind. That mind held the cosmos together and gave human beings a connection to the cosmos or a pathway to the divine. Many religious philosophies are specifically idealist. The belief that beings with knowledge preceded in sentient matter seems to suggest that an experiencing subject is a necessary reality. Hindu idealism is central to Vedanta philosophy and to such schools as Kashmir Shaivism. Proponents include P.R. Sarkar and his disciple Sohail Anayatullah. Christian theologians have held idealist views, often based on Neoplatonism. Despite the influence of Aristotelian scholasticism from the 12th century onward, later Western theistic idealism such as that of Hermann Lotso offers a theory of the world ground, in which all things find their unity. It has been widely accepted by Protestant theologians. Several modern religious movements, for example the organizations within the New Thought movement and the Unity Church, may be said to have a particularly idealist orientation. The theology of Christian Science includes a form of idealism. It teaches that all that truly exists is God and God's ideas, that the world as it appears to the senses is a distortion of the underlying spiritual reality. A distortion that may be corrected through a reorientation of thought. Wang Yangming, a Ming Chinese Neo-Confucian philosopher, official, educationist, calligraphist and general, held that objects do not exist entirely apart from the mind because the mind shapes them. It is not the world that shapes the mind but the mind that gives reason to the world, so the mind alone is the source of all reason, having an inner light, an innate moral goodness and understanding of what is good. The consciousness-only approach of the Yogacara school of Mahayana Buddhism is not true metaphysical idealism, as Yogacara thinkers did not focus on consciousness to assert it as ultimately real. It is only conventionally real since it arises from moment to moment due to fluctuating causes and conditions, and is significant because it is the cause of karma and hence suffering. Platonism and Neoplatonism. Plato's theory of forms or ideas describes ideal forms as universals existing independently of any particular instance. Arngrim calls this doctrine the classic example of a metaphysical idealism as a transcendent idealism, while Simone Klein calls Plato the earliest representative of metaphysical, objective idealism. Nevertheless, Plato holds that matter is real, though transitory and imperfect, and is perceived by our body and its senses and given existence by the eternal ideas that are perceived directly by our rational soul. Plato was therefore a metaphysical and epistemological dualist, an outlook that modern idealism has striven to avoid. Plato's thought cannot therefore be counted as idealist in the modern sense. Although quantum physics' assertion that man's consciousness is an immutable and primary requisite for not merely perceiving but shaping matter, and thus his reality, would give more credence to Plato's dualist position. With the Neoplatonist Plotinus, wrote Nathaniel Alfred Bohl, there even appears, probably for the first time in Western philosophy, idealism that had long been current in the East even at that time, for it taught that the soul has made the world by stepping from eternity into time. Similarly, in regard to passages from the Enneads, the only space or place of the world is the soul, and time must not be assumed to exist outside the soul, Ludwig Neure wrote. For the first time in Western philosophy we find idealism proper in Plotinus. However, Plotinus does not address whether we know external objects. Unlike Schopenhauer and other modern philosophers, subjective idealism describes a relationship between experience and the world in which objects are no more than collections or bundles of sense data in the perceiver. Proponents include Berkeley, Bishop of Cloyne, an Irish philosopher who advanced a theory he called immaterialism, later referred to as subjective idealism, contending that individuals can only know sensations and ideas of objects directly, not abstractions such as matter, and that ideas also depend upon being perceived for their very existence. Ses percipi, to be is to be perceived. Arthur Collier published similar assertions, though there seems to have been no influence between the two contemporary writers. The only knowable reality is the represented image of an external object. Matter as a cause of that image is unthinkable and therefore nothing to us. An external world as absolute matter unrelated to an observer does not exist as far as we are concerned. The universe cannot exist as it appears if there is no perceiving mind. Collier was influenced by an essay towards the theory of the ideal or intelligible world by Cambridge Platonist John Norris. Bertrand Russell's popular book The Problems of Philosophy highlights Berkeley's tautological premise for advancing idealism. If we say that the things known must be in the mind, we are either unduly limiting the mind's power of knowing, or we are uttering a mere tautology. We are uttering a mere tautology if we mean by in the mind the same as by before the mind, i.e., if we mean merely being apprehended by the mind. But if we mean this, we shall have to admit that what, in this sense, is in the mind, may nevertheless be not mental. Thus, when we realize the nature of knowledge, Berkeley's argument is seen to be wrong in substance as well as in form, and his grounds for supposing that idea, i.e., the objects apprehended must be mental, are found to have no validity whatever. Hence his grounds in favor of the idealism may be dismissed. The Australian philosopher David Stove harshly criticized philosophical idealism, arguing that it rests on what he called the worst argument in the world. Stove claims that Berkeley tried to derive a non-tautological conclusion from tautological reasoning. He argued that in Berkeley's case the fallacy is not obvious, and this is because one premise is ambiguous between one meaning which is tautological, and another which, Stove argues, is logically equivalent to the conclusion. Alan Musgrave argues that conceptual idealists compound their mistakes with use, mention confusions. Santa Claus the person does not exist. Santa Claus, the name, concept, fairy tale does exist because adults tell children this every Christmas season, and proliferation of hyphenated entities such as thing in itself, things as interacted by us, table of common sense, and table of physics, which are warning signs for conceptual idealism according to Musgrave, because they allegedly do not exist but only highlight the numerous ways in which people come to know the world. This argument does not take into account the issues pertaining to hermeneutics, especially at the backdrop of analytic philosophy. Musgrave criticized Richard Rorty and postmodernist philosophy in general for confusion of use and mention. A. Luce and John Foster are other subjectivists. Luce, in Sense Without Matter, attempts to bring Berkeley up to date by modernizing his vocabulary and putting the issues he faced in modern terms, and treats the biblical account of matter and the psychology of perception and nature. Foster's The Case for Idealism argues that the physical world is the logical creation of natural, non-logical constraints on human sense experience. Foster's latest defense of his views is in his book A World for Us. The case for phenomenalistic idealism. Paul Brunton, a British philosopher, mystic, traveller, and guru, taught a type of idealism called mentalism, similar to that of Bishop Berkeley, proposing a master world image, projected or manifested by a world mind, and an infinite number of individual minds participating. A tree does not cease to exist if nobody sees it, because the world mind is projecting the idea of the tree to all minds. John Searle, criticizing some versions of idealism, summarizes two important arguments for subjective idealism. The first is based on our perception of reality. All we have access to in perception are the contents of our own experience, and the only epistemic basis for claims about the external world are our perceptual experiences. Therefore, the only reality we can meaningfully speak of is that of perceptual experience, whilst agreeing with Searle argues that is false and points out that does not follow from them. The second argument runs as follows. Premise: any cognitive state occurs as part of a set of cognitive states and within a cognitive system. Conclusion 1. It is impossible to get outside all cognitive states and systems to survey the relationships between them and the reality they cognize. Conclusion 2. There is no cognition of any reality that exists independently of cognition. Searle contends that conclusion 2 does not follow from the premises. Epistemological idealism is a subjectivist position in epistemology that holds that what one knows about an object exists only in one's mind. Proponents include Brand Blanchard. Transcendental Idealism. Transcendental Idealism, founded by Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, maintains that the mind shapes the world we perceive into the form of space and time. If I remove the thinking subject, the whole material world must at once vanish, because it is nothing but a phenomenal appearance in the sensibility of ourselves as a subject, and a manner or species of representation. Critique of Pure Reason A383. The second edition contained a refutation of idealism to distinguish his transcendental idealism from Descartes's skeptical idealism and Berkeley's dogmatic idealism. The section Paralogisms of Pure Reason is an implicit critique of Descartes' idealism. Kant says that it is not possible to infer the I as an object purely from the spontaneity of thought. Kant focused on ideas drawn from British philosophers such as Locke, Berkeley and Hume, but distinguished his transcendental or critical idealism from previous varieties, the dictum of all genuine idealists, from the Eleatic school to Bishop Berkeley, is contained in this formula. All knowledge through the senses and experience is nothing but sheer illusion, and only in the ideas of the pure understanding and reason is there truth, the principle that throughout dominates and determines my transcendental idealism is, on the contrary, all knowledge of things merely from pure understanding or pure reason is nothing but sheer illusion, and only in experience is there truth. Prolegomena 374. Kant distinguished between things as they appear to an observer and things in themselves, that is, things considered without regard to whether and how they may be given to us. We cannot approach the noumenon, the thing in itself, without our own mental world. He added that the mind is not a blank slate, tabula rasa, but rather comes equipped with categories for organizing our sense impressions. In the first volume of his Periga and Paralipomena, Schopenhauer wrote his sketch of a history of the doctrine of the ideal and the real. He defined the ideal as being mental pictures that constitute subjective knowledge. The ideal, for him, is what can be attributed to our own minds. The images in our head are what comprise the ideal. Schopenhauer emphasized that we are restricted to our own consciousness. The world that appears is only a representation or mental picture of objects. We directly and immediately know only representations. All objects that are external to the mind are known indirectly through the mediation of our mind. He offered a history of the concept of the ideal, as ideational, or existing in the mind as an image. True philosophy must at all costs be idealistic. Indeed, it must be so merely to be honest. For nothing is more certain than that no one ever came out of himself in order to identify himself immediately with things different from him, but everything of which he has certain, sure, and therefore immediate knowledge, lies within his consciousness. Beyond this consciousness, therefore, there can be no immediate certainty. There can never be an existence that is objective absolutely and in itself. Such an existence, indeed, is positively inconceivable, for the objective, as such, always and essentially has its existence in the consciousness of a subject. It is therefore the subject's representation, and consequently is conditioned by the subject, and moreover by the subject's forms of representation, which belong to the subject and not to the object. The World as Will and Representation, Volume 2, ch. 1. Charles Bernard Renouvier was the first Frenchman after Nicolas Malebranche to formulate a complete idealistic system, and had a vast influence on the development of French thought. His system is based on Immanuel Kant's, as his chosen term, criticisme indicates, but it is a transformation rather than a continuation of Kantianism. Friedrich Nietzsche argued that Kant commits an agnostic tautology and does not offer a satisfactory answer as to the source of a philosophical right to such or other metaphysical claims. He ridicules his pride in tackling the most difficult thing that could ever be undertaken on behalf of metaphysics. The famous thing in itself was called a productive philosophical habit, which seeks to introduce a grammatical subject, because wherever there is cognition, there must be a thing that is cognized, and allegedly it must be added to ontology as a being. Yet he attacks the idealism of Schopenhauer and Descartes with an argument similar to Kant's critique of the latter.